Tuesday nights were always a scramble for me, especially on the second Tuesday of the month when my club meeting started right at 6:30. Hannah and I would usually step through the door around 5 o'clock or maybe 5:30, which barely left me enough time to catch my breath. Since the meeting included dinner, cooking wasn't on my mind, but Hannah, my wife of 4 years, somehow always found little chores for me to tackle before I could even think of leaving. I had my own internal struggle to deal with, though. Hannah, 3 months along and dealing with her hormones, was still the captivating woman I'd fallen for, and now, with that glowing look of a mom-to-be, it was even harder to pull myself away from her, even just for a few hours. In my eyes, she was flawless. She stood at 5 feet 3 inches and weighed in at 110 pounds, with soft brown hair and those piercing blue eyes that could stop me in my tracks. But it was more than just her looks. I admired her sharp mind and how she noticed the smallest details. As much as I loved her, I had to leave by 6:10 to make it on time. This meant a fast shower, throwing on some clothes, a quick kiss for her, and out the door. I usually wouldn't get back home until after 11 o'clock, closer to midnight most times. Tonight didn't look like it would be any different. After a quick shower, I threw on a pair of slacks and a sports shirt, grabbed my briefcase, and headed through the kitchen toward the garage. I gave Hannah a quick kiss on the back of her neck, squeezed her shoulders for a moment, and left reluctantly. Part of me wanted to skip the meeting, not just for Hannah but because I had a project going in the garage, installing a baby monitor for the nursery. I figured it'd take about 30 more minutes to finish, and then I could show it off to Hannah. She usually liked to see my little projects come together, and I didn't mind the appreciation, even if she sometimes overstated it. A little bit of ego boosting from her never hurt. Once I was in the car, I hit the garage door opener and started the engine. I set my briefcase on the seat beside me and checked for the essentials. My phone, calculator, and notebook, all good. I backed down the driveway, glancing up to wave at Hannah through the kitchen window as she washed dishes. She waved back as I reached the end of the driveway. Just as I was about to shift gears and close the garage door with the remote, my cell phone rang, catching me off guard. As I answered, I looked up to wave at Hannah one more time, but she'd already moved out of view. The caller explained that the meeting was off for tonight. Our president, Samuel, along with Mason and Eli, had been called out of town, so they decided to cancel this month's gathering. No urgent business, so it meant a free evening for me. I simply reversed back into the garage, noting Hannah was no longer in the kitchen window. After parking and closing the door, I stayed in the car for a moment, taking in the sudden shift in plans. I thought I'd order a pizza for dinner and use the evening to wrap up the monitor project. Most of the setup for the camera in the nursery was done, with just a few connections left in the garage to finish. The nursery was coming together nicely, and I'd already mounted the camera discreetly in a corner, so small that Hannah hadn't even noticed it over the past 10 days. I'd put the final touches on later, and Hannah had mentioned how useful a monitor would be to check on the baby while it napped, so I thought I'd wire the whole house with audio monitors in each room. 2. The visual monitor idea came from some old equipment a friend gave me. The main controls were in our bedroom, but I installed a secondary setup in the garage where I spent a lot of time. With speakers and an old TV as the video monitor, I could check in from nearly any room in the house. Just a few final adjustments, and I could finally show it off to Hannah and relax for the night. After stepping out of the car, I started going over the setup. 20 minutes later, everything seemed to be running smoothly. Testing the sound feeds, I began with the living room, and they all came through loud and clear. I could even hear Hannah taking a shower in the master bedroom from the feed. Quite impressive sensitivity for a $12 set of speakers. I set all the sound channels to feed into the garage and moved on to the final connections for the video monitor. While I was deep into wiring, I suddenly heard Hannah's voice come through the living room speaker. Sounded like she was on the phone. Out of curiosity, I turned up the volume, noting how clear it was. Best $12 I'd spent in a while. Her voice drifted through, asking someone named Edward to be there by 7 o'clock. He replied with, "Okay, love. I'll see you then. Don't be late. We don't have nearly enough time as it is, and no, don't expect a repeat." She laughed and hung up. My stomach twisted. Who was Edward? The only Edward the First knew was Edward Thompson, the husband of Samantha, Hannah's college roommate and close friend. Edward was a jokester, always the life of the party. Maybe they were planning something for Samantha? I tried to shake it off, but it stayed on my mind. It was almost 7 o'clock, and I had no time to sit around wondering. Switching on the baby room camera, I leaned back and felt a sense of satisfaction when I saw the clean, organized view of the spare bedroom. The camera captured the bed, window, and closet, pretty much everything except for the corner where I'd installed it. Happy with the image quality, I cleaned up my workbench and grabbed a beer from the old fridge, kicking back in the $150 recliner I'd rescued for the garage after Hannah vetoed it for the house. As I sipped my beer, thinking about dinner, the front doorbell rang. A few moments later, I heard Hannah greeting someone with a slight edge to her voice, as if she were annoyed. She invited Edward in and told him they had until 10:30. "Until then, I'm all yours," she said, her voice slipping into a tone that made me feel sick, the kind of sultry, intimate tone I'd only ever heard from her in our bedroom. I nearly choked on my beer. I heard the door close, and Hannah's voice continued, playful and suggestive, teasing him about the bulge in his pants and telling him it looked good. She asked him to give her a proper hello, and then there were noises, grunts, moans, all of it unmistakably intimate. Then I heard her telling him to follow her to the bedroom, saying it was all set up for them. I felt like my head was spinning. Could Hannah really be leading Edward to our bedroom? My mind reeled. I wanted to burst into the kitchen, throw him out, demand to know what was happening, but I held back, hoping there was some explanation. After all, Hannah and I had a deep connection, a solid love, and I'd never questioned her loyalty. Sure, she'd joke around when she saw me admiring a pretty woman, but it was just harmless fun. I'd never felt the urge to stray, and I thought we were on the same page in every way that mattered. She'd always seemed happy with our intimacy, savoring those moments between us. Surely, this was just a misunderstanding. We were best friends, eagerly awaiting the birth of our child. As I sat in my old recliner, lost in thought, I noticed movement on the monitor I'd set up in the baby's room. The door opened, and Hannah led Edward inside, guiding him toward the freshly made bed. She positioned him by the window, then turned to face the closed closet doors, practically staring into the camera, though she was likely unaware of it. She was wearing her old Saturday morning robe, which barely reached her mid-thigh. Her hair was pinned up in a graceful bun, and her makeup was flawless, making her look stunning despite the worn robe. She even wore the high-heeled slippers I'd gifted her for her birthday, the same ones she hadn't touched since that night. Seeing this, my eyes began to sting with tears. This couldn't be happening. Not with her. Hannah stood there, meeting Edward's gaze with a bold confidence. She raised her hands to the neckline of her robe, gripping it with her left hand as her right hand began undoing each button one by one, giving Edward teasing glimpses. When she'd unbuttoned the robe completely, her right hand moved back to her throat. With a deliberate slowness, she pulled the robe open and let it frame her figure before finally letting it fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore the lingerie I had given her on Valentine's Day, the same set I hadn't seen on her since then. She lifted her hand, beckoning Edward closer, and as he approached, I could see the awe on his face. He stammered, telling her, "I was expecting to see you tonight, but you went all out for this." He added, "God, you're beautiful." Both of them began to undress. In a fog, I knew I needed proof of what I was seeing. I quickly slipped into the living room, grabbed a blank SD card, returned to the garage, and connected it to the monitor, making sure everything was running. My heart sank as I watched them on the screen, moving to the bed and sharing an intimacy that seemed to go on forever. Edward thrust into her relentlessly, and I felt sick, utterly lost, unable to decide what to do. After what felt like an eternity, Hannah pulled away. I stood up, pacing in the garage, the urge to confront them bubbling up, though I knew it would likely end in violence. "Edward," she said, catching her breath, "if you don't want William to walk in on us, you'd better get going." She grabbed his clothes, thrust them into his arms, and then took off her lingerie, tossing it onto the dresser. Without waiting for him to fully dress, she slipped her robe back on and stripped the sheets from the bed, hauling them into the laundry room just off the kitchen and garage. When she returned to the living room, Edward was there, grinning and saying they should consider doing it again sometime. "This was a one-time thing," she replied firmly. "Only because of our deal." Edward nodded, throwing in a hint that maybe it was for old time's sake as well, and suggested that if she ever remembered how good it was, they could think about doing it again. I could hear a sloppily exchanged kiss before Edward's footsteps moved toward the door, followed by her impatient sigh as she walked him out. Feeling shattered, I sank back into my battered recliner, staring at the monitor now displaying the empty room. Checking my watch, I saw it was 10:37, just as they had planned. I heard murmuring at the front door, Hannah reiterating to Edward that it was a one-time thing because of their past agreement. She reminded him that I was her husband, her true partner, the man she wanted to spend her life with. She seemed uncertain, questioning why they'd done this now, even saying that Samantha was her best friend and meant more to her than a fling ever could. She even asked Edward if he really cared about Samantha. I couldn't quite catch his response, but I heard one last kiss before the door finally shut, followed by the sound of the lock clicking. If I hadn't been so devastated, I might have laughed at the exhaustion in Edward's voice after his tryst with my wife. But there was nothing funny about any of this. After closing the door, Hannah reappeared in what I could no longer think of as the baby's room. She scanned the room, ensuring nothing was out of place, then gathered her clothes and went down the hall. Soon, I heard the familiar sound of her showering, and after that, the bed rustling. I assumed she'd gone to sleep. It was close to 11 o'clock by then, and I just sat there, numb, lost in 1,000 racing thoughts. Was there a way to make sense of this? Should I have seen this coming? What had I done to drive her into another man's arms? Around midnight, feeling worn down, I turned off the monitors and dragged myself inside through the garage door. I made my way to the master bedroom, passing the spare room, which was now stripped bare, with nothing visibly out of place. I groaned quietly and went into our bedroom. Glancing at Hannah, who was already asleep, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and try to compose myself. After stripping down, I checked the laundry hamper before tossing in my clothes, noting it was empty. No trace of her discarded lingerie. Climbing into bed, I felt Hannah roll over and wrap an arm around me. She mumbled, asking how my night had been. After a pause, I replied that it had been traumatic, but I'd explain later. Usually, she'd snuggle up, but tonight she pulled her arm back and rolled over, seemingly falling asleep right away, though her breathing hinted she might still be awake. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though I'd never sleep again. When the alarm went off the next morning, I was still in the same spot, too drained to face the day. I mumbled to Hannah that I thought I'd caught the flu and stayed in bed until I heard her leave for work. Once I was alone, I carefully searched her dresser. At the very bottom, hidden inside a paper bag beneath a pile of sweaters, was the lingerie she'd worn for Edward, still damp and ruined. My stomach churned, but I pushed forward, calling in sick and spending the morning making duplicate copies of the video. I noticed details I'd missed the night before and became more certain of what I had to do. Around 4:30, Hannah got home as usual. She leaned in to kiss me, but I turned away, which seemed to throw her off. By 5:30, I knew it was time to confront her, to get to the bottom of everything. The questions, the pain, the betrayal. I couldn't hold them in any longer. I knew there was no sense in dragging this out any longer. Putting it off would only make things harder for me. So I looked at Hannah and asked if she had a few minutes to check out what I'd been working on for the baby monitor project. She glanced up, saying we could talk after dinner since she was about to start cooking. Not wanting to wait, I picked up my phone and asked if she'd prefer takeout. She suggested Chinese, so I went ahead and ordered it for delivery. Once that was settled, I took her into the bedroom to demonstrate the monitor system. I showed her the console I'd set up behind the door, explaining how it worked. Leaving the sound on, I walked from room to room, speaking to her through the monitor. Although she couldn't reply, the look on her face when I returned to the bedroom told me she was impressed. It was working even better than I'd planned. Then I turned on the video feature and told her to keep watching. I stepped into the spare room, standing in the spot where she'd been the night before, and did a playful little move, mimicking a slow dance. When I returned, she laughed and exclaimed, "William, this is amazing. When did you set all this up?" I told her, casually, that I'd worked on it last night. Her smile faltered a bit, like she was trying to recall when I'd had time to do it. I mentioned that I'd set up something extra in the garage since I spent so much time there. I explained that I thought it'd be practical to keep an eye on the baby even while I was out there working. Trying to hide my building anger, I led her to the garage, where I plugged a USB drive into the TV. "Watch the screen," I said, "and see how it works." The screen initially showed our empty bedroom, with the bed unmade, exactly as it had been the night before. Then I switched over to footage that showed Hannah on her knees in front of Edward. Her face drained of color, and she seemed to lose her balance as she registered what she was seeing. I didn't look away. I kept my eyes on her, fast-forwarding briefly. When she looked back at the screen, Edward was tugging at her underwear, and while the video had no sound, we could both see her saying something to him. She watched in horrified silence until a soft gasp escaped her, and she brought a hand to her mouth, trembling. I caught a glimpse of her tears and the way she flinched at Edward's roughness. Finally, I stopped the video and looked at her. "Do you want to see more?" I asked. She looked back at me, speechless, her face a mask of helplessness. I told her to follow me inside the house so we could talk seriously, and we went to the kitchen where I sat her down at the table. Through her tears, she muttered that she could explain, and I said that I was ready to hear it. I asked her directly about the promise she'd made to Edward back in college, wanting to know how long this agreement had been hanging over our lives. Hannah took a shaky breath and started to explain. She said it wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. She and Edward had been involved back in college, though he was known for being a player. She said that around the same time she'd started rooming with Samantha, and eventually Edward began dating both of them for a while. She described the complex dynamic between the three of them, saying that Edward and Samantha's relationship grew more serious over time. One night, she and Edward had been drinking in her room, and things took a more intimate turn. She admitted that she'd confided to Edward that her biggest fear was getting pregnant, which was the reason she hadn't taken things further with him. Edward, she said, expected his partners to be on birth control, but she'd been hesitant to go along with his expectations. Then, she said they'd argued, and in a reckless moment, she'd written him a promissory note, stating that if she could ever be certain she wouldn't get pregnant, she'd spend a night with him. I stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. "When was this?" I asked. She whispered, "About 6 years ago." She said that ever since then, the note had been a running joke between her and Edward. Then, 2 weeks ago, when we shared the news of her pregnancy with Samantha and Edward, things changed. After offering their congratulations, Edward and I had gone out to the garage to talk about a car issue he was having, leaving Hannah and Samantha alone. Hannah said that Samantha had confronted her about the promissory note, telling her that it was time to honor it. Hannah said she was stunned to realize that Samantha even knew about the note, and even more shocked that she was serious about it. When Edward and I returned, I'd remembered that I had a case of Dutch beer in the garage for the upcoming cookout and had excused myself to grab it, leaving them alone again. Apparently, during that time, Samantha brought up the note once more, and Hannah was horrified to realize that Edward also expected her to fulfill the promise. According to her, he got defensive when she expressed doubts about going through with it. After a night of steady drinking, she said, she'd reluctantly agreed to keep her word. By the time I came back, it had already been decided that she would entertain Edward. I sat back, struggling to process everything she'd just told me. "This is the strangest story I've ever heard, Hannah. How am I supposed to believe it?" Then I looked her in the eye. "And who is the father of this baby, Hannah?" She shrank away, fresh tears filling her eyes. My next question cut even deeper. "How many other promises have you made and kept?" She broke down, screaming at me. "None. None, William, I swear. I love you." Please, don't do this. She was practically pleading, saying it was a one-time mistake and begging me to believe her. Hannah dropped to her knees in front of me, covering her face as she sobbed, pleading for me to listen. I took a breath, feeling my heart ache as I looked down at her. Okay, I said, but I need to ask some questions, and I need you to be completely honest. She nodded, saying she'd tell me everything. Through her tears, she kept insisting that it was a one-time mistake, something she never wanted to do, that it all felt surreal to her now. You mean everything to me? She whispered. I looked at the woman kneeling in front of me, the woman I had trusted more than anyone, my partner, my best friend. But I needed to know who she really was. Hannah, did you really have to go through with this? Couldn't you have just said no? She looked up at me, broken but determined. I could have, but I felt like my honor was on the line, she said, her voice barely audible. She explained that she'd been terrified to tell me, afraid I wouldn't understand. I thought if you were in my shoes, you'd have done the same, she whispered. She went on to clarify that she'd been drunk when she'd made the original promise, but hadn't brushed it off when she sobered up. She told me that back then, she hadn't even met me, and that it wasn't meant to be a betrayal against me. Taking a deep breath, I looked at Hannah and told her that she'd had plenty of chances to walk away from this promise, especially once she'd sobered up. Yet, she'd chosen to keep it, believing she owed it to the man Edward had become. When I asked if that was true, she nodded, confirming it. I pressed her to think carefully. Had she looked forward to this at all? She burst out, saying that at first, she thought the whole thing was a joke. But she quickly realized it wasn't. It was all too real. I held her gaze. So, over these last 2 weeks, did you anticipate this moment? She hesitated, taking a shaky breath. No, she said quietly. I felt like I had to go through with it. Not that I wanted to. Then, her voice softened even more as she looked down. Okay, yes, William, she whispered. I guess I was looking forward to it in a way, but not like you think. She explained that she never intended to betray me, but once it felt inevitable, she figured she might as well make the most of it. It wasn't that I wasn't enough for her, she insisted. It was just that she felt bound by that old promise. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I held my composure, taking slow breaths to keep my voice steady. I reminded her of a memory from about 6 weeks ago, when I called her from my cell while driving back from a conference. We'd teased each other over the phone, and I'd suggested we meet at the Holiday Inn in Atherton for a little getaway. She smiled faintly, saying she remembered and that it had been a great weekend. Did you want to make it special? I asked, probing further. Her smile widened a bit, and she nodded, saying, Of course I did. It was a wonderful time together. I pressed on, asking her what she'd packed for that weekend. She mentioned the dress she'd brought for dancing, and I nodded, recalling that night. But I wasn't done. I told her to wait and went back to the bedroom, signaling for her to follow me. She seemed a bit confused but came along, and I powered up the bedroom TV, hitting play on the remote. The screen filled with the scene of her kneeling before Edward. She shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks reddening as she realized what I was showing her. I paused and asked her what she'd worn that night. She blushed and admitted it was the white lingerie set I'd given her for Valentine's Day, the same set she'd only modeled for me once when I first bought it for her. I looked her in the eye. You didn't bring that to the Holiday Inn, though, did you? I said quietly. You wore a peasant skirt, a white blouse, and that night you slipped into a simple cotton bra and underwear. Maybe the same set you're wearing now. She nodded slowly, clearly remembering. And do you remember what you wore to bed that night? I asked, feeling a pang in my chest. She hesitated, then said in a small voice, My Donald Duck t-shirt. I stared at her, my hurt spilling over. You told me that weekend was special, Hannah, that it meant something. Yet you wore one of the nicest things you own, the gift I gave you meant for us, to him instead. Can you see how that makes me feel? Her shoulders slumped as she looked at me, a mixture of guilt and shame filling her eyes. I continued, my voice barely holding steady. Hannah, if I didn't love you, we wouldn't be living in this house together. If I didn't think you were special, I wouldn't have married you. I told her how my unexpected call had canceled the meeting the night before, leading me straight into this nightmare. I described what I'd seen on the monitor, her greeting Edward at the door, leading him into a room she'd prepared, performing a seductive strip show for him in an outfit she'd never worn for me. I reminded her how she'd told me the encounter was meaningless. Yet she'd dressed herself up, styled her hair, and done her makeup, all things she hadn't done for me in so long. Everything I'd witnessed suggested that she'd put extra care into this, making it a special occasion. While our time together had started to feel routine, even unimportant, tears welled up in Hannah's eyes, and she blinked them away, her face filled with remorse. She kept insisting it wasn't what it seemed, that she loved me and I meant everything to her. I sank onto the edge of the bed, looking up at her, feeling completely lost. I don't know what comes next, I admitted, but I think we need to sit down with Edward and Samantha. There's more here that I'm not seeing. I asked if she thought Samantha knew about everything, and she hesitated but finally nodded. Without another word, I dialed their number. Samantha answered, and I asked if they could stop by later. While I was on the phone, the doorbell rang with our Chinese food delivery. I forced myself to eat a few bites, though my appetite was non-existent. Hannah barely touched her food, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her reassurances that it was all just a one-time mistake, that she still loved me. But there was too much that didn't add up. Around 7:15, the doorbell rang again, and this time, it was Edward and Samantha. Before I let them in, I turned to Hannah and told her I had a feeling there was more to this story than she even knew. As I opened the door, both Edward and Samantha smiled, but I couldn't ignore the strange, knowing look they exchanged with Hannah. Edward's gaze lingered on her with a possessive intensity, and I noticed Hannah cringe slightly under his stare. We all moved to the couch, and I gestured for Hannah to sit beside Samantha, but she chose to sit off to the side in her recliner instead. I tried to ease into the conversation, mentioning the new monitoring system I'd set up, though I didn't reveal what it had captured. Samantha and Edward seemed puzzled, unsure why they'd been called over. To ease the tension, I offered everyone a drink, and they all accepted. I poured Samantha a glass of white wine, gave Edward his Jack Daniels with 7-Up, offered Hannah orange juice because of the pregnancy, and poured myself a gin and tonic, though I'd only used tonic water. I took a seat on a hassock by the TV, carefully observing everyone, trying to keep my composure. Finally, I looked directly at Samantha and asked her, "What was your motivation behind setting all this up?" She gave me a confused look, asking what I meant. I clarified, "Why did you go through all the trouble to orchestrate this?" Edward choked on his drink, caught off guard, and I shifted my focus to him. "I get why you might have an interest in this, but what's really behind it?" I watched the reactions closely, switching my gaze between him, Hannah, and Samantha. I addressed Edward, bringing up his reputation as a bit of a playboy, implying that this hardly seemed worth the risk for him. He stumbled over his response, claiming he'd been at home the previous night when my meeting was supposed to happen, supposedly there to support Hannah with the setup in the spare room. He even tried to bolster his story by pointing out the live feed from the room, which he said he'd helped configure before arriving. I couldn't help but comment on the impeccable timing of it all, hinting that I was on to him. Hannah buried her face in her hands, clearly struggling to hold herself together, while Edward turned pale, realizing the walls were beginning to close in. Samantha gave me a sly, almost taunting smile. Ignoring her look, I pressed forward, questioning the purpose behind this convoluted setup. She crossed her legs, her foot bouncing nervously, and asked what I thought all this meant. I looked her in the eye and mentioned her and Edward's reputations, noting that despite their open-minded approach, rumors had been circulating. While no one had said anything to us directly, I suspected it was only a matter of time. Samantha took a deep breath, acknowledging that this probably wasn't the best way to bring it up, but agreed it was time to confront the issue. I glanced at Hannah, who looked entirely blindsided. Up until now, I'd assumed she was aware of everything, but seeing her reaction made me question that. I explained that Samantha and Edward had been part of a key club for a few years, a group that met every Friday night to swap partners for the weekend. Each couple would bring a house key, drop it in a barrel, and after dinner, the men would draw a key. The wives would go home to prepare for the weekend with a new partner. The men who drew their own key had to draw again, and each was allowed only 2 redraws. It wasn't just a short fling. These rendezvous lasted the entire weekend. Since Samantha and Edward were close to us, they had apparently led others to believe that we were also involved in this club. Many men in their circle had expressed interest in Hannah, and Edward had certainly been among them. The room fell silent as I finished explaining. Hannah sat there, stunned, while Samantha wore a smug smile, her foot still tapping nervously. Edward, looking a bit relieved, smirked, and I couldn't ignore the triumphant gleam in his eye. Clearing my throat, I looked directly at Hannah and said, "Before we go any further, there's something you should know about your lover from last night." Hannah's face paled as I reminded her of what was at stake for our marriage. I pointed out how Edward was considered a prize within their key club, with other wives eagerly hoping to spend a weekend with him. Edward's smirk grew as I spoke, and I noticed Samantha glancing smugly at Hannah, who seemed to shrink in her seat, looking up at me with an almost sickly expression. I leaned back, taking a long drink of my tonic, which felt as bitter as the whole situation. Letting the silence hang, I observed Edward's smug grin while Samantha seemed like she had more to say. Finally, she broke the silence, saying that this arrangement brought excitement to their marriage and kept things from becoming dull. She suggested that loosening up could be good for my relationship with Hannah and that we might even grow closer. Edward nodded in agreement, flashing his usual grin. Samantha went on, insisting that it could be a way to spice things up and assured us there was no pressure. We could take our time deciding if we wanted to join them. Listening to her, I held back my disgust and replied calmly, "Thanks for being honest, Samantha, but I've never considered this type of arrangement, and I have no plans to start now." I emphasized that Hannah and I valued a faithful, committed relationship and didn't need partner swapping to keep things interesting. Then I shifted my tone, focusing on a more immediate issue. I told them that Edward's lack of safe practices was a serious concern, especially with Hannah being pregnant. I said she would need to see a doctor right away to check for any STDs, which put us in a complicated and stressful position. Until she was tested and cleared, intimacy between us was off the table. I made sure Hannah understood the gravity of what we were facing. Turning to Samantha and Edward, I expressed a deep sense of betrayal and told them that we'd be cutting off all social gatherings with them indefinitely.